Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Last Camper's Signal. The sun was setting when they found it. A rusting radio tower standing crookedly against the purples and reds of the fading sky. It was tucked away on the side of the remote mountain trail, barely visible behind a curtain of pine trees. Dan, the self-proclaimed leader of their camping trip, spotted it first. "Check this out," he called, pointing at the hulking structure. His voice carried an edge of excitement that only comes with finding something no one else has. Behind him, Lindsay, Mike, and Tara exchanged wary glances. The trip was supposed to be a weekend escape, a way to disconnect from their exhausting city lives. None of them had signed up for rusting towers and potential tetanus shots. "Maybe we should just keep moving," Tara suggested, her arms crossed tightly against the growing chill in the air. "Oh, come on," Dan replied, already making his way through the underbrush. "It's just a radio tower. What's the worst that could happen?" Mike chuckled nervously. Famous last words, man. Still, curiosity got the better of them, as it often does with these kinds of things. The group followed Dan, trudging through the thick foliage until they reached the tower. Up close, it looked even more menacing. The metal beams were speckled with rust, and the base was surrounded by weeds and discarded cans that had been there long enough to be unrecognizable. "What's that noise?" Lindsay asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They all froze, straining their ears. At first, it sounded like static, a faint hiss barely audible over the wind. Then it became clearer, a soft, rhythmic beeping. "Is that Morse code?" Mike asked. Dan pulled out his phone, his face glowing in the fading light as he Googled Morse code translations. "It's an SOS," he said after a moment. "No way," Tara said, stepping back. "This is weird. We should leave." But Dan was already climbing the rickety ladder attached to the tower. "Relax," he called down. "It's just an old tower. Probably someone messing around with a signal generator or something." The rest of them stayed rooted to the ground, watching as Dan reached the small cabin at the top. He disappeared inside, and for a moment, all they could hear was the wind rustling through the trees. Then his voice echoed down. "Guys, you gotta see this." Reluctantly, they climbed up after him, the ladder creaking under their weight. Inside the cabin, they found a dusty, claustrophobic space filled with outdated radio equipment. Most of it looked broken, wires dangling like dead vines from the ceiling. "Who do you think sent the SOS?" Lindsay asked, her voice trembling. "No idea," Dan said, fiddling with one of the dials. "This thing shouldn't even be working. The signal's coming from somewhere nearby, though." "Nearby," Tara repeated. Mike pointed out the window toward the darkening woods. "Maybe there's another station out there or something." Dan grinned. Only one way to find out. They followed the signal deeper into the woods, each step feeling heavier than the last. The beeping grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them forward. Lindsay was the first to see it, a tattered tent partially hidden by a thicket of brambles. She stopped in her tracks, her stomach twisting at the sight. "Dan," she whispered, "what the hell is that?" The group gathered around the tent, their flashlights illuminating the fabric stained with dark, crusted streaks. Blood. Nope. Nope, 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 Tara said, backing away. Dan crouched down, peering inside. The smell hit him first, a metallic tang mixed with a sour stench of decay. Inside, he saw shredded sleeping bags and what looked like claw marks gouged into the ground. Dan, we need to go, Lindsay said, her voice breaking. Dan stood up, his face pale but determined. Whoever was here needed help. They sent that SOS for a reason, and now they're gone, Tara snapped. Or worse, Mike was about to chime in when the beeping stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, through the static of their walkie-talkies, a voice crackled. They're behind you. They spun around, their flashlights darting through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the whisper of the wind. Who the hell said that? Mike demanded, his voice shaking. Maybe it's the radio tower, Dan suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. No, Tara said, her voice tight. That came from the walkies. Lindsay pointed toward the tent. We need to leave. Now. They started back toward their campsite, their pace quickening with every step. The woods, once serene and inviting, now felt oppressive, the trees pressing in on them like silent spectators. The walkie crackled again. Don't run, the voice said, low and guttural. Tara screamed, and they broke into a sprint. The sound of footsteps followed them, heavy and deliberate, matching their frantic pace. When they finally reached the campsite, they collapsed in a heap, their chests heaving. We're leaving, Dan said, his bravado gone. First thing in the morning, but morning felt an eternity away. As they huddled together by the dying campfire, the radio in Dan's pack came to life. Static hissed, followed by a low, rhythmic hum. What now? Lindsay whispered, tears streaming down her face. Dan hesitated before pulling the radio out. He adjusted the dials, trying to silence the noise, but instead, a new message came through. You can't leave. The fire flickered, casting long shadows across their pale faces. And then they saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness beyond the firelight. The walkie crackled one last time. We see you. They were never found. Months later, hikers discovered their abandoned campsite, the radio still emitting a faint SOS. The locals avoided the area, whispering about the cursed tower and the poor souls who wandered too close. Sometimes, on quiet nights, campers swear they can hear it, a faint beeping in the distance, calling them deeper into the woods. Story 2. Beneath the moonlit marsh. When Sam and Laura found the marsh, it was like stepping into another world. The silvery glow of the water under the rising moon cast an ethereal light on the surrounding trees, their gnarled branches stretching skyward like ancient fingers clawing for something unseen. The air was thick but not oppressive, the kind of humid stillness that felt timeless, untouched. It was perfect, too perfect. Laura was the first to comment on it. It's so quiet here, she said, glancing around as they set up their small tent near the edge of the marsh. No birds, no crickets, nothing. Sam shrugged, unfazed. Peaceful, that's all. Just us and nature. He grinned, tossing a log into the fire pit. You said you wanted to get away from it all. Congratulations. You got your wish. By the time the fire crackled to life, its warm glow adding a welcome contrast to the marsh's cool shimmer, they'd settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sam roasted marshmallows while Laura sat cross-legged on a blanket, sketching the scene before her. She was an artist, always looking for beauty in the mundane, but this place was anything but ordinary. Then came the first splash. It wasn't a small ripple, the kind you'd expect from a fish or a frog. It was heavy, deliberate, as if something large had broken the surface and slipped back under. Did you hear that? Laura asked, her pencil hovering above the page. Sam nodded, standing up and aiming his flashlight toward the water. Probably a deer or something. Deer don't swim. Well, maybe it's an otter. Or a beaver. Another splash. Closer this time. Laura dropped her sketch pad, eyes fixed on the marsh. Sam, that's not an otter. The water stilled, the silvery glow rippling like molten metal. For a moment, it was silent again, as if the marsh itself was holding its breath. Then they heard it, a low, guttural sound, half moan, half growl, emanating from somewhere deep beneath the surface. Let's go inside the tent, Laura whispered, clutching Sam's arm. Sam hesitated but nodded, his bravado slipping. They zipped themselves into the safety of the tent, the thin nylon walls offering little comfort. Outside, the splashes continued, irregular and ominous, until finally, hours later, they stopped. The next morning, the marsh was different. Where's the water? Laura asked, standing at the edge of what had once been a shimmering expanse. The marsh had receded during the night, leaving behind a muddy, cracked basin that stretched for yards. Pools of stagnant water shimmered in the early sunlight, but the heart of the marsh was dry and littered with bones. Sam's stomach twisted as he stepped closer. Human bones. Skulls with empty sockets stared up at him, their grimaces frozen in time. These are people, Laura stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sam, these are the missing people. Local legends spoke of disappearances in the area. Hikers and campers who'd wandered too close to the marsh and were never seen again. Sam had dismissed the stories as small-town folklore, but now, staring at the skeletal remains, he wasn't so sure. We need to leave, Laura said, her voice trembling. Now, Sam nodded, but as they packed up their gear, the marsh began to fill again. Water bubbled up from unseen depths, spreading like ink across the muddy basin. By the time they zipped their packs closed, the marsh had returned to its previous silvery beauty, as if the horrors beneath had never existed. That night, the glow was brighter. Why is it so bright? Laura asked, shielding her eyes as she looked out from the tent. The marsh shimmered like a pool of liquid light, its glow almost blinding against the darkness of the surrounding forest. Sam didn't answer. He was staring at the water, his face pale. Sam, do you see that? He whispered, pointing. At first she didn't. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the glow, she saw them, figures rising from the water. Shadowy forms, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They moved slowly, deliberately, their movements unnatural, as if controlled by unseen strings. "There's more," Laura choked, her voice cracking. More figures emerged, dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on the tent. The air grew cold, and the once silent marsh was now alive with a low, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "What do we do?" Laura whispered, clutching Sam's arm. "We run," he said, grabbing the flashlight. They bolted from the tent, their boots sinking into the muddy ground as they sprinted toward the tree line. The figures moved faster than they should have been able to, their shadowy forms gliding over the marsh as if untouched by gravity. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, the sound filling their ears and minds until it felt like it was inside them. Sam stumbled, falling face first into the mud. Laura screamed, yanking him to his feet. "Keep going," she shouted. They reached the forest, the thick canopy blocking out the unnatural glow of the marsh. For a moment, it felt like they'd escaped. But then they heard it, the squelching sound of mud and water, the wailing growing louder. The figures were following. By morning, they'd made it to the road, dirty and exhausted but alive. As they climbed into their car and sped away, Laura glanced back one last time. In the distance, the marsh glowed faintly in the rising sun, as serene and beautiful as ever. But she knew better. Beneath its shimmering surface, the marsh wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it was waiting. Story 3. The Forgotten Campsite. Tom and Jeremy had planned this hiking trip for weeks, eager to escape the noise of the city and breathe in the fresh air of the forest. They had pored over maps, marked trails, and even practiced setting up a tent in Tom's backyard. But no amount of preparation could have readied them for what they were about to experience. By the third day, the trail became less familiar. The dense forest swallowed the path they had been following, leaving them relying on Jeremy's compass and Tom's stubborn determination. "We'll find our way back," Tom said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's just a bit further." But as the sun began to sink behind the trees, the realization set in. They were lost. Just when panic started to creep in, Jeremy spotted it, an old campsite, tucked into a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Relief washed over them. "We can regroup here," Jeremy said, dropping his pack. The sight was eerie. Rusted poles from an ancient tent frame jutted out of the ground like broken bones. Moldering canvas lay scattered, torn and weather-beaten. A fire pit sat at the center, ringed with smooth black stones, its ashes long cold. Pieces of gear, tin cups, a knife, a cracked lantern, were strewn about as if someone had left in a hurry. Tom's voice broke the silence. "Looks like this place hasn't been touched in decades." Jeremy shivered. "Feels wrong." "Wrong or not," Tom replied, "it's getting dark. We'll make camp here for the night and figure out the way back in the morning." Reluctantly, Jeremy agreed. The first thing they noticed was the cold. As night fell, the temperature plummeted unnaturally fast. Tom swore under his breath as he tried to start a fire. The wood, though dry, refused to catch. Even their matches seemed to sputter out too quickly. "It's freezing," Jeremy muttered, rubbing his hands together. But the cold wasn't the worst of it. It was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of nature, but an oppressive, smothering stillness. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped. Even their voices felt muted, swallowed by the dark. Tom froze suddenly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Jeremy," he whispered. "Look." Jeremy followed his gaze to the dirt around the fire pit. Footprints. At first, he thought they were their own, but the size was all wrong. These prints were massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, and oddly misshapen, with claw-like impressions at the toes. "Those aren't ours," Jeremy said, his voice trembling. Tom nodded, swallowing hard. "They weren't here when we set up camp." Jeremy's flashlight flickered, its beam weak and sputtering. In its unsteady glow, the print seemed to lead away from the camp and vanish into the trees. "Let's leave," Jeremy said. Tom hesitated, glancing at the dark woods. "In the middle of the night? We'll get even more lost." "I don't care," Jeremy snapped. "Something's not right here, Tom." Tom sighed, but relented. They packed their gear quickly, nerves on edge, and set off in what they thought was the direction of the trail. It didn't take long for them to realize something was very, very wrong. No matter how far they walked, the forest seemed to twist and turn back on itself. Familiar landmarks reappeared in impossible ways. A gnarled tree with a hollow trunk, a moss-covered boulder, a fallen log split down the middle. And then, the campsite. They stumbled back into the clearing, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "No," Jeremy whispered. "No, no, no." Tom stared at the tattered tents and rusted gear as if seeing a ghost. "We've been walking in circles. That's not possible." Jeremy yelled, his voice cracking. The cold deepened. Frost began to form on the ground, creeping up the edges of their boots. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a whisper, so soft it was barely audible. "Do you hear that?" Jeremy asked, his voice trembling. Tom nodded, his face pale. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, overlapping, rising and falling like a macabre chorus. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. Despair. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing. Then another. Jeremy's flashlight flickered to life just long enough to catch a glimpse. Figures, pale and hollow-eyed, their bodies translucent, hovering just above the ground. They wore tattered clothing, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. "The campers," Tom choked out. One of the figures stepped forward, its hand outstretched. Its mouth opened, and the whisper became a piercing scream. "Run!" Tom shouted. They bolted into the woods, not caring which direction they went, only wanting to escape. The whispers followed, weaving through the trees, growing louder and more desperate. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they found themselves in another clearing. But this one was different. The trees were dead, their branches gnarled and twisted. In the center stood a massive stone, covered in ancient, unreadable symbols. "What is this?" Jeremy whispered. Tom stepped closer, his hand brushing the surface of the stone. A jolt of cold shot through him, and he stumbled back. The whispers stopped. Silence fell again, heavier this time, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, from behind them, The figures emerged, dozens of them, their hollow eyes fixed on the hikers. Tom and Jeremy backed toward the stone, their terror mounting. The figures didn't move quickly. They didn't need to. They knew there was no escape. As the first of the apparitions reached them, its icy hand grasping Jeremy's shoulder, he let out a scream that echoed through the forest. The next morning, the campsite was empty. The frost had melted, the footprints were gone, and the tattered tents lay undisturbed. Somewhere deep in the forest, the stone stood silent, its symbols glowing faintly in the morning light. And in the dirt around it, two new sets of footprints began to fade, as if they had never been there at all. Story 4. The Eyes in the River. The river seemed like the perfect escape, winding lazily through a stretch of untouched wilderness. It was postcard perfect. Blue skies above, dense woods framing its banks, and the serene sound of water sloshing against the sides of their kayaks. For the group of teenagers, Emma, Derek, Claire, and Liam, it was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, laughter, and an excuse to unplug from their noisy, mundane lives. The first day passed without incident. They paddled under the warm sun, stopping occasionally to swim or snack on the riverbank. They joked about the horror stories Claire loved to tell, but the setting was too peaceful to take her seriously. That night, they set up camp on a small sandy bank. A fire crackled in the center of their makeshift circle, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The group swapped stories, their laughter echoing across the water. It wasn't until Liam stepped away to fetch more firewood that things began to feel off. "Do you see that?" Liam called, standing near the water's edge. "See what?" Emma asked, walking over. Liam pointed to the river. There, just beneath the surface, two faint orbs of light glimmered. They were small, round, and unmistakably watching. Probably just a reflection, Derek said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. But the light moved, ever so slightly, against the current. It wasn't a reflection. As the group gathered near the riverbank, more glowing eyes began to appear. First 2, then 4, then 10. The water seemed to come alive with them, scattered like stars in the depths. "Fish," Claire whispered, though she was already inching backward. Emma shook her head. "No fish glows like that." They backed away, unsettled but trying to rationalize it. The night dragged on uneasily. The laughter faded, replaced by silence and the occasional crackle of the fire. No one mentioned the glowing eyes again, but no one slept much either. By morning, the eyes were gone, and the river had returned to its tranquil state. It was enough to convince the group that they had overreacted. They packed up and continued downstream, though the mood was noticeably subdued. Around midday, the river began to change. The current, once gentle and inviting, grew sluggish. The air felt heavy, as though the forest were holding its breath. The trees lining the riverbank seemed to lean in closer, their gnarled branches reaching toward the water like fingers. "I don't like this," Claire said, her voice trembling. "We'll find a better spot to stop soon," Derek said, though he, too, was paddling faster. Then they saw it. The water ahead shimmered unnaturally, as if a veil of mist hung low over the surface. And within that mist, the eyes returned. Dozens of them, hundreds. They floated in clusters, bobbing just beneath the surface. "Don't stop," Liam said, his voice tight with fear. The group paddled harder, but the river seemed to fight them. The current pushed back, growing stronger with every stroke. The glowing eyes multiplied, their light pulsing in a rhythm that felt deliberate, as if they were alive and aware. The river grew eerily still around them, despite the pressure of the current. The sound of rushing water was replaced by an unnatural silence. Then the voices started, soft at first, like whispers carried on the breeze. "Emma." Her paddle froze mid-stroke. "Who said that?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "What?" Derek asked, but before she could answer, the whispers came again, louder this time, overlapping and echoing. "Claire, Derek, Liam." They all heard it now. The voices were coming from the water, from the eyes staring up at them. "Paddle," Derek shouted. They paddled with all their strength, but the river had other plans. The current shifted, pulling them backward toward the mist. The glowing eyes formed a tight circle around their kayaks, and the water beneath them began to churn. "What the hell is that?" Claire screamed, pointing ahead. The mist cleared just enough to reveal a dark whirlpool, its edges lined with jagged rocks. The glowing eyes spiraled toward it, as if drawn by an unseen force. "It's pulling us in," Liam shouted. Their paddles were useless now. The whirlpool's pull was too strong. Emma gripped the edge of her kayak, her knuckles white. The voices grew louder, almost deafening. They no longer sounded human but deep and guttural, like something ancient and monstrous. "Give yourself to us," the voices demanded, in unison. "No," Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the roar of the whirlpool. Claire's kayak tipped first, sending her tumbling into the water. She surfaced briefly, screaming, before being dragged under. "Claire!" Derek shouted, but before he could reach her, his kayak was pulled sideways. The glowing eyes swarmed him, and he disappeared beneath the surface, his screams cutting off abruptly. Liam and Emma clung to their kayaks, tears streaming down their faces. The whirlpool loomed closer, the water around it bubbling and hissing like it was alive. "We have to jump," Liam yelled. "Are you insane?" Emma shouted back, "Better than going in there." Before Emma could respond, Liam leapt from his kayak and swam toward the riverbank. He didn't get far. The water surged, pulling him back. The glowing eyes surrounded him, and he vanished with a strangled cry. Emma was alone now, her kayak teetering on the edge of the whirlpool. The voices softened, almost soothing now. "Join us," they whispered. The glowing eyes surrounded her, staring expectantly. With one final scream, her kayak tipped, and she was swallowed by the dark water. By morning, the river was calm again. The kayaks drifted empty, their occupants gone without a trace. The water sparkled under the sun, and the glowing eyes were nowhere to be seen. But the river remembered. It always did, and it waited patiently for the next group of campers to wander too close. Story 5. The Shadow Campfire. It was the kind of day that made you feel like the woods had a secret to tell, but you weren't sure you wanted to hear it. The sun was sinking low behind the jagged mountain ridges, casting long shadows over the hiking trail. The air was still, save for the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. Her friends, Ben, Lisa, Mark, and Sarah, had been hiking all day, taking in the towering trees, the chirping birds, and the overwhelming sense of isolation that only the wilderness could provide. But now, as the evening light began to fade and the shadows stretched longer, they noticed something strange. "Is that a campfire?" Sarah asked, stopping in her tracks. Ben squinted ahead, where the trail opened into a small clearing. At first, it looked like a flicker of sunlight caught in a patch of trees, but the closer they got, the clearer it became. There was definitely a campfire burning. "Yeah, but there's no one around," Mark observed. The fire was odd. It burned with an eerie, steady flame, unwavering despite the lack of wind. It sat in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by nothing but dense woods. The shadows cast by the flickering flames seemed exaggerated, stretching unnaturally across the clearing. "Should we check it out?" Ben asked. "Probably someone camping," Lisa suggested, but something in her voice didn't sound sure. The group continued forward, their footsteps soft on the mossy earth. As they approached the fire, they realized there was no sign of anyone. No tent, no sleeping bags, no gear scattered around. Nothing. "That's weird," Sarah said, eyeing the empty space around the fire. Ben bent down to get a closer look, the warmth from the fire radiating on his face. He reached out, and with a swift motion, he extinguished the flame. The embers crackled briefly before dying out, leaving only the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. The clearing was suddenly bathed in twilight. The wind began to stir gently through the trees, and the shadows of the forest shifted as night took hold. But something fell off. The four of them stood in silence for a moment, the forest suddenly quieter than before. Then Lisa noticed it, an odd, lingering feeling, as if the fire hadn't really gone out at all. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadows on the ground were still moving, but the flames were gone. The shadows, long and twisted, seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally, as if they had a life of their own. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the longer they stared, the more they realized the truth. The shadows weren't from the trees. They were from something else. Mark took a step back, his heart beginning to race. "That's not possible." Ben's eyes widened in horror. "They're moving." The shadows began to shift, not just across the ground, but upwards, creeping across the trees. And then they did something far worse. They began to take shape. Each shadow grew distinct features, tall and looming, figures that seemed to mirror their own. The shadows seemed to bend and twist into forms, shapes that mimicked the contours of their bodies, but not quite. "Get back," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. "Those aren't normal shadows." Ben swallowed hard. What the hell is going on? Before he could react, the shadow in front of him shifted. It was him, his own silhouette, but distorted. The shadows of his body grew taller, the outline more jagged and cruel. His own shadow twisted its arms, reaching out toward him. No, 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 Mark muttered under his breath, backing up, but his own shadow reached for him too. The darkness within it became too deep to comprehend, like a black hole threatening to swallow him whole. Run, Lisa screamed, but as they turned to flee, the shadows began to move faster, faster than the humans could. They circled, their forms multiplying, until it felt like they were surrounded on all sides by dark, shifting shapes. The figures seemed to move independently of the fire, their glowing eyes staring at the four of them. Please, just leave us alone, Sarah whimpered, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. She turned to look back and saw something that froze her blood. The shadows weren't just following anymore. They had begun to mirror their movements perfectly. Sarah's own shadow was now walking beside her, its feet matching hers step for step. But it was no longer just a shadow. Its eyes gleamed with a cold malice. Stop, she cried. But it didn't stop. The shadows mimicked their every move. No matter how fast they ran, the figures of darkness followed, their bodies now moving in perfect synchronicity with their own. The deeper they ran into the woods, the more the shadows closed in, until they were no longer just reflections of light. They were something else, something darker. They were becoming real. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, they realized they weren't running from shadows at all. The shadows were inside them now, as if they had been taken. Ben felt at first a cold, sharp sensation on his back, like fingers tracing his spine. He turned around, but there was nothing there. The others had stopped too, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They could hear the sound of their own voices, soft at first, then louder. Ben, Lisa, Mark, Sarah, the voices echoed, each one growing louder and more distorted. It was their own voices calling them, repeating their names over and over. But they didn't recognize them anymore. It was like the shadows had stolen their souls, taken their very essence, and now they were playing with it, mimicking it. Before Ben could turn to speak, the shadow of himself stepped forward. It wasn't him anymore. It was something darker, something that didn't belong, and it was moving toward him. No, he shouted, but his voice sounded wrong. Then it happened. The shadow lunged. The darkness overtook him in a single heartbeat. He was gone. Lisa screamed as the same thing happened to her. Her own shadow, now a twisted version of her, grabbed hold of her. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was her. Mark and Sarah tried to run, but it was useless. The shadows had already taken them. The last thing Sarah saw was Mark's face, distorted with terror, as the shadows consumed him. And then, the forest was still again, as if nothing had happened. The fire had burned out, and the clearing was empty. Just the wind rustling through the trees, and the lingering presence of something darker than night itself. Somewhere in the distance, a new fire burned, and in the shadows, something watched. Story 6, The Howling in the Hills. It was supposed to be the perfect family camping trip. They had everything. The tents, the backpacks, the coolers filled with food, and the serenity of the hills surrounding them. A small family, mom, dad, and their 2 kids. had driven out to a secluded spot in the foothills for a weekend away from the noise of their suburban lives. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the only things you could hear were the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the soft murmur of the wind. They'd set up their camp just before sunset, a clearing nestled between two steep hills, with a shallow creek running nearby. It was beautiful, too beautiful maybe. It felt like one of those places in the movies, the kind where you knew things would go wrong, but you never expected it to happen to you. As night settled in, the stars began to peek through the darkening sky. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the woods surrounded them. The fire crackled in the center of their campsite as they roasted marshmallows, laughing at the kids' attempts to tell ghost stories. But then, the howling started. At first it was distant, barely a whisper carried on the wind, so faint that they weren't sure if they had heard it at all. But the moment they heard it again, sharper and clearer, their laughter faltered. "Hear that?" Dad asked, his voice quiet. "I think it's wolves," Mom said, though she didn't sound sure. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold, despite the warmth of the fire. The kids, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stopped their game of tag and huddled closer to the fire, their faces illuminated in flickering orange light. They'd heard stories of wolves in the hills. The idea of them being nearby wasn't comforting. "Wolves howl at night," Dad said, trying to ease the tension. "They're far off. They won't come near us." But even as he said it, the howls grew louder. Not just one, but many, echoing through the hills. It was unsettling, like a pack of wolves, but the sound was too deep, too strange. Another howl, closer this time. Mom grabbed a flashlight and stood up, scanning the dark woods surrounding them. The beams cut through the trees but revealed nothing but shadows. "We're fine," Dad said, trying to sound confident. He reached for the tent's zipper, but as he pulled it down, another howl came from the hills. This one sounded almost human. The kids froze. The high-pitched, haunting cry sent a chill crawling up their spines. It wasn't the sound of an animal anymore. It was a wail, sharp, tortured, and unmistakably human. "Okay," Mom said, her voice trembling. "Let's get inside the tent." Now, they scrambled into the tent, zippered it up quickly, and huddled together. The fire outside sputtered, and the darkness crept in, swallowing them whole. The howls didn't stop. If anything, they grew closer, each one sounding like it came from a creature half-wolf, half-man. The wind seemed to carry the sound of heavy footsteps, dragging through the underbrush, circling their campsite. The trees creaked and groaned, and somewhere in the distance, there was the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping under weight. Dad tried to stay calm, but there was a tremor in his voice. "It's probably just a coyote or something. Maybe a mountain lion. We'll be fine." But Mom wasn't so sure. She gripped her children tightly, feeling her heart hammer in her chest. The howls now sounded too close, almost inside the campsite. Then, silence. The family sat frozen in the dark. Not a single sound could be heard. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the creak of branches. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. Mom was the first to break the silence. "I'm going to check the fire," she said quietly, not waiting for anyone's permission. Dad nodded, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the tent. Okay, but stay close. No matter what. They unzipped the tent and stepped outside cautiously. The fire was still burning, but it had weakened, its orange glow flickering weakly. The air was colder now, far colder than it had been before. And the howls? They had stopped completely, but something wasn't right. Dad stepped closer to the fire, and his eyes went wide. His voice dropped to a whisper. Look at the trees. Mom turned, her stomach churning. The bark of the trees surrounding their campsite had deep, jagged scratches carved into them. Some of them were so deep it looked as though the trees had been gouged by something massive. And the marks, those marks were too large to belong to any animal they knew. Something was watching them. Something had been watching them all night. They looked at the ground. That's when they saw footprints. Huge, distorted prints that were both animal and human, pressed into the soft earth. The tracks led toward the forest, disappearing into the darkness. The family quickly zipped up the tent again, huddling in fear, hearts racing. They didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the tent, every snap of a twig outside made their bodies tense in terror. The howls never came again, but the heavy presence in the woods outside was enough to keep them awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, the forest seemed peaceful again. The silence was almost oppressive in its normalcy. But as they gathered their things to leave, Dad noticed something that made his blood run cold. Claw marks, gigantic, deep claw marks, etched into the trees around their camp. Too large to be the work of any bear, too deep for any wolf. The marks seemed to circle the campsite, as if the thing had been watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The family left immediately, hearts racing, looking over their shoulders every step of the way. They didn't care that it was a beautiful day or that the sun was shining through the trees. They knew one thing for sure. The hills weren't home to wolves. They weren't home to anything natural. They were home to something far older, something that didn't let outsiders leave. The howling in the hills hadn't stopped. It had only just begun. Story 7. The Starlit Curse. The meadow was silent when they set up camp, a wide open space far from the nearest town, where the night sky stretched above them like a black canvas waiting to be filled. There were 5 of them: Claire, John, Lucas, Sarah, and Matt. Amateur astronomers. They had made the long trek out into the woods to witness a celestial event that hadn't occurred in centuries. A rare alignment of the stars, something the ancient cultures once worshipped, would happen that night. A rare sight, they all agreed, and an experience they wouldn't miss for the world. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that only comes in the deep woods, and as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, they set up their telescopes. Sarah, the most excited of them all, could hardly keep still, her fingers fumbling with the equipment, eager to see the stars align in all their glory. Do you think the ancients knew something we don't? Lucas asked, squinting up at the sky as he adjusted his telescope. Who knows? John replied, laughing. But whatever happens, we'll be the first to see it. Matt, quiet as usual, didn't answer. He wasn't the type to get overly enthusiastic, but he was here because his friends were, and that was enough. He sat down on a log, watching the others, a small fire crackling nearby to ward off the chill. They spent hours looking up at the sky, waiting for the moment the stars would align. The air seemed to hum with anticipation. As the appointed time neared, the night grew still. The wind had stopped, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, had gone quiet. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then it happened. The stars began to shift, slowly at first, but then more rapidly. What had been a random scatter of points in the night sky started to form distinct shapes, forming a pattern. At first, the campers assumed it was the alignment they had been waiting for, but then the symbols began to change, twisting and warping into shapes they could not comprehend. A strange energy filled the air, an unseen force pressing down on them, and a deep, resonant hum filled their ears. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she leaned forward, eyes wide in disbelief. I don't know what this is," Lucas whispered, his voice hoarse. His hands shook as he tried to look through the telescope again, but it wasn't focusing. He stepped back, his face pale. The symbols in the sky kept shifting. Ancient shapes, lines, and circles that none of them could place. But all of them felt were somehow wrong, unnatural. And then the voices started. At first, it was faint, a whisper just on the edge of hearing, as though the wind itself was speaking. But then the whispers grew louder, and the words began to make sense, though not in any language any of them knew. It sounded like a chant, rhythmic, ancient, and disturbing. John, the most logical of the group, shook his head. "This isn't right. We need to leave. This is..." Before he could finish his sentence, Sarah suddenly stood up, her eyes glazed over, her lips moving in time with the chant they could hear now. It was like she wasn't there anymore, her body a puppet of some unseen force. Her hands reached toward the trees as if being pulled by invisible strings. "Sarah," Claire called, but her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. Sarah's head jerked toward them, her mouth open wide, but no sound came out. Instead, her body turned toward the forest, moving without her control, and she began to walk slowly into the woods. "Sarah!" Claire screamed again, rushing forward to grab her, but the air around them seemed to thicken, making her steps heavier. It was like walking through wet cement. Matt was the next to fall under the spell. His body stiffened, and then, without a word, he followed Sarah's footsteps toward the woods. Claire reached out to stop him, but her hand passed through him as though he wasn't even there. John and Lucas stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear, but neither moved. The stars above burned brighter now, the symbols in the sky flashing faster. It was as if the heavens themselves were unraveling, twisting in on themselves. "What's happening to them?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling. But before John could answer, the ground seemed to ripple beneath their feet, as if the earth was alive. The air grew colder, the whispers from the forest louder, and the pressure in the air intensified. They watched, helpless, as Sarah and Matt disappeared into the darkness of the trees. Then Lucas screamed. John whipped around to see him standing on the edge of the firelight, his hands clutching his throat. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth open, but no sound came out. He staggered back, his legs giving out beneath him as his body convulsed. John reached out, but Lucas crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide and vacant, and his body lay motionless. It was then that John understood. The stars weren't aligning. They were opening a doorway to something ancient, something that had been waiting in the darkness for eons. The symbols, they were a summons. They were bringing something through, and it had used Sarah and Matt as vessels. It had begun with them, but now it was taking Lucas too. And John was next. The ground began to shake beneath him, the earth pulsing with the rhythm of the chant. John turned to run, but the mist in the forest had already begun to rise, wrapping around him like cold fingers, pulling him back toward the trees. The last thing he heard was the sound of his name, whispered from the darkness. And then everything went silent. The next morning, a search party arrived. They found no trace of the campers, no sign of their tents, no sign of their equipment, and no sign of the fire they had made. The only thing they found was the sky above, perfectly clear, with no hint of the strange symbols that had once danced there. The forest, it seemed, had claimed them, and the stars, high above, waited patiently for the next group to come and witness their dark alignment. Story 8. The Sleeping Woods. It was supposed to be a harmless dare, a weekend away from the distractions of college life, a place to drink, joke, and prove they weren't afraid of some stupid ghost story. The woods, they'd heard, had a name for making people disappear, but none of them believed it. Not really. Ghost stories were for children, not for them, adults with plans and futures. It started with a legend. The Sleeping Woods, they called it, a patch of trees deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest town. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was simply haunted, but everyone agreed. If you camped there, there was a chance you wouldn't wake up. And if you didn't wake up, your memories of who you were would be erased. There'd be nothing left of you but a shadow. But Sam, the brave one, scoffed. It's just a myth. It's just trees and dirt. It's probably just some creepy campers trying to scare people off so they can have the place to themselves. We'll go, we'll camp, and we'll be back by Sunday night. No big deal. And so, Sam, along with his friends Mia, Ethan, and Lucas, piled into their old truck, all of them eager to prove they weren't afraid. The forest was dense, the trees ancient and twisted, their limbs like arms stretching out to grab anything that dared to venture too deep. The air had that musty, earthy smell, moist, suffocating almost, as they trekked in. The sound of their boots crunching on the forest floor was the only thing that broke the silence. By the time they reached the clearing where they'd set up camp, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, crooked shadows. Ethan pitched the tent, Lucas gathered firewood, and Mia laughed as she unpacked the cooler, setting out cans of beer and snacks. Sam, ever the instigator, tossed a log on the fire and smirked at his friends. "You're not really buying into all that ghost stuff, are you?" he asked, grinning like a kid in a candy store. "You're all too scared of some stupid trees." Mia chuckled nervously. "I'm not scared. Just weirded out, I guess. Something about this place feels off. Don't you think?" Ethan shrugged, taking a long swig from his beer. It's just the trees. They make all kinds of noises. Don't overthink it." But as the night went on, the forest seemed to close in around them. The sounds of distant animals became muffled, and the wind, when it did come, had an unnatural, almost sorrowful quality to it. The fire flickered and danced, casting tall, eerie shadows across their faces. They talked for hours, laughing about old college stories and arguing over which horror movie was the scariest. Around midnight, when the conversation lulled and the night grew colder, they decided to call it a night. Mia and Lucas crawled into the tent first, while Sam and Ethan stayed by the fire for a bit longer, poking at the embers. But before Sam could make his way to the tent, he froze. He heard something in the woods, something faint, a whisper maybe, or was it footsteps? "Did you hear that?" he whispered to Ethan. Ethan raised an eyebrow, peering into the darkness. "It's just the wind." But Sam's gut told him something was wrong. There was no wind, and the air felt too still. He stood up, his heart thumping in his chest. But before he could take a step, a loud crack, like a tree snapping, echoed in the distance. He glanced back at Ethan, who was now standing, eyes wide. What the hell was that? The two of them stood in silence, staring into the night. Nothing, not a sound, not a movement. And then they heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable, the rustling of leaves, like someone walking around them in the woods. "No one's out there," Sam muttered, his voice more to himself than to Ethan. "Just the trees, playing tricks." But the rustling didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, closer, until they both felt a prickle of unease creeping up their spines. Suddenly, the rustling stopped, and in its place, a soft, hollow whisper. "Leave now." It was faint, but it felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sam's blood ran cold. He turned to Ethan, but before either of them could speak, a scream shattered the silence. "Mia." They bolted toward the tent, the shadows of the trees twisting around them like gnarled fingers. They shoved the flap open, and Mia was standing there, her face pale, her hair wild, her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Sam demanded. Mia's voice shook. I woke up, and Lucas wasn't in here. He was just gone. I called his name, but nothing. And then I saw something outside, something watching me. The temperature dropped, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Sam tried to shake it off, trying to focus on the task at hand. "Where did you last see him?" Sam asked. "I don't know," Mia stammered. "It was just everything felt wrong. Like I woke up in the wrong place, at the wrong time. And Lucas, he was just gone, and I don't know what happened." They searched the woods, calling Lucas's name, their voices echoing back to them with an unnatural eeriness. But there was no sign of him, no trace, no footprints. The next day, they found strange symbols etched into the trees around their camp. Intricate, jagged marks that didn't look like anything from nature. They seemed deliberate, ancient almost. That night, Mia disappeared. Her cries for help, faint and distant, echoed through the trees. Sam and Ethan were left in the tent, terrified. They couldn't run. They couldn't leave. The woods wouldn't let them. The next morning, it was just Sam and Ethan. But things had changed. They couldn't remember how long they'd been there. Hours? Days? It felt like time didn't matter in the sleeping woods. The symbols on the trees had grown, multiplied, spreading deeper into the forest. They had moved. The trees weren't static. They were alive, growing and shifting, bending to something older than them. Sam turned to Ethan, but there was something wrong in his eyes. Something hollow, something empty. "Ethan," Sam asked, his voice trembling, "are you okay?" Ethan didn't respond. His gaze drifted into the forest, and then, as if on cue, he began walking toward the trees. "Ethan, stop! Come back!" Sam shouted, but Ethan kept walking, his steps slow and steady, as if he didn't hear Sam at all. And just like that, Sam understood. They weren't just being watched. They were being erased. The forest wasn't just taking them. It was unmaking them, making sure they were forgotten, like they had never existed. The last thing Sam saw before everything went black was the tall figure of Ethan, walking deeper into the woods, his body becoming a shadow. No longer a friend, no longer a person. And then Sam was gone too. Just a fading memory, a whisper in the dark. Story 9, the cries from below. The sun had just started to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the rocky plateau. The campsite was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. A small group of campers, for friends on a weekend adventure, were setting up their tents by the edge of the cliff, with nothing but wild forest below them and miles of empty land stretching out to the horizon. Ryan, Emma, Luke, and Sarah had all been friends since childhood, but something about this trip felt different. The air was thicker here, more oppressive, as if the land itself was holding its breath. But none of them said anything. They just set up the camp, made their fire, and ate their dinner as the sun slowly faded into night. It wasn't until after they had settled around the fire that they first heard it. A faint sound, a cry. At first, they all thought it was just the wind, maybe a bird or an animal in the distance. But the more they listened, the clearer it became. A human voice, low and muffled, almost as if someone were calling for help from beneath the earth itself. Ryan, the bravest of the group, was the first to stand. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice strained as he peered into the darkening landscape. "Hear what?" Emma asked, furrowing her brow. "It's coming from down there," Ryan said, pointing toward the cliff's edge. "It sounds like someone's calling for help." The others listened. The cry came again, this time louder, more distinct. Help me. Someone's down there," Luke muttered, standing up as well. "We gotta check it out." Emma looked at him, then at the others. "Are you crazy? It's probably just some animal. We're not climbing down there in the dark." But Ryan and Luke were already moving, heading toward the edge of the plateau where the sound had come from. Emma hesitated for a moment, then followed, with Sarah trailing behind her reluctantly. The edge was steep and treacherous, the rocky surface slippery with moss and loose stones. They carefully made their way down, their flashlights cutting through the thickening night. The air was cooler here, damp, and the ground beneath their boots seemed to tremble with each step. "Do you think someone really needs help?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky as they neared the bottom of the cliff. I don't know, Ryan said, his face set in grim determination. But we won't know until we check it out. They reached a small clearing at the base of the cliff. The air was still, the only sound the rustling of the leaves overhead. The cry came again, only this time it was clearer, more urgent. "Help me, please." "This is insane," Emma muttered. "We shouldn't be doing this." "I agree," Sarah whispered, eyes wide with fear. "But it sounds like someone's really in trouble." Ryan, though, wasn't listening. He was already moving toward a small outcrop of rocks ahead. There was a narrow crevice between two boulders, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. As he approached, the sound of the cries grew louder, almost deafening. He could feel the vibrations in his chest, like a deep, guttural rumble coming from the earth itself. "This way," Ryan said, pointing to the crevice. "It's coming from in there." "No way," Emma said, her voice trembling. "There's no one in there." But Luke, ever the curious one, was already crawling into the narrow gap, his flashlight bouncing in front of him. Ryan followed suit, then Emma, then Sarah. They moved in single file, the rock walls pressing in on them as they squeezed deeper into the cave. The cries were constant now, unrelenting. They sounded like they were coming from the very bowels of the earth. The deeper they went, the louder the cries became, until it was all they could hear, until it was all they could feel. And then something changed. The cries started to distort. The sound warped. It wasn't just a call for help anymore. It was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and twisting, each one a broken version of the last. "Help me, help me, help me." But the voices were becoming wrong. "Help me, please, help me, Emma." Emma froze. Did that voice just say my name?" She whispered, her voice cracking with fear. Before anyone could answer, the cries shifted again, this time mimicking Luke's voice. "Luke, help me, please, help me, Luke." Luke's face went pale. "That's impossible," he said, his voice quivering. That's me." The air around them grew colder. The ground beneath their feet shifted, a low rumble coming from somewhere deep within the earth. And then, suddenly, the cave began to collapse. The walls cracked, dust falling from the ceiling, and the passageway that had been narrow to begin with seemed to narrow even further. The rocks around them shook violently, and the sound of the cries became unbearable, deafening. "Run!" Ryan shouted. They turned and bolted, scrambling through the tightening gap, the walls closing in on them with every second. The cries followed them, growing louder and more frantic. But it wasn't just the voices of the trapped souls anymore. The sound was shifting again, distorting like a broken tape recorder. And then they heard it, their own voices. "Help me, Ryan. Help me, Ryan." It was their own voices, distorted and twisted. Each voice came from somewhere in the walls around them, echoing and mocking them, pulling them deeper into the cave. Panic set in as they scrambled toward the entrance, their hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst into the open air, gasping for breath, the cries fading behind them as they stumbled back toward the campsite. The forest was silent again. "Did you hear that?" Sarah gasped, her face pale. "I don't know," Ryan muttered, his voice hoarse. "But I think it heard us." And somewhere, deep below the earth, something was still calling for them, still waiting for the next group of campers. Story 10. The Forest That Feeds. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense woods as the group of scouts made their way to the clearing they'd chosen for the night. It had been a long hike, and their feet were sore from trudging through the thick forest floor. The air was cool but heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. "Perfect spot," said Lucas, the eldest scout, as he dropped his heavy pack onto the ground. He was the kind of guy who always seemed to know exactly where to go. The others had followed him with little question, trusting his experience. This was their annual camping trip, the one they'd all been looking forward to. But something about tonight felt off. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that the forest was watching them. The trees loomed higher than usual, their trunks thick and twisted like ancient giants. And the silence. It wasn't the usual nighttime hum of insects and animals. It was a deep, unnatural stillness, broken only by the sound of their own movements. "I'll go start the fire," said Maria, her voice breaking the quiet tension that seemed to have settled around them. As she moved toward the fire pit, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled. Looking down, she saw that the earth seemed to ripple beneath her foot, as though the ground itself had shifted. She shook it off, muttering something under her breath about the forest being weird tonight. The others had begun setting up their tents, unpacking their gear, but there was a noticeable unease among them. Even Lucas, the seasoned leader, seemed distracted. His eyes darted back to the trees, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary on the dark shapes that loomed around them. "Everything okay?" Maria asked as she returned to the group, her arms full of kindling for the fire. Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, just keep an eye on things. Something's off about this place." As the fire crackled to life, they all gathered around it, the warmth a temporary relief from the chill that had begun to settle over the forest. It felt good to be close to the fire, the flickering flames pushing back the shadows, but the tension lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. The first oddity came when Tommy, the youngest of the scouts, noticed something strange. He'd been staring at the ground absent-mindedly, but then his gaze shifted upward, his eyes wide with confusion. Did you see that?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. The others turned to look, their eyes following Tommy's pointed finger. At first, they saw nothing but the normal stretch of trees and underbrush. But then, in the corner of their vision, something shifted, a faint, almost imperceptible movement within the trees. "I don't see anything," said Lucas, his voice tense. "I swear I saw it," Tommy insisted, his face pale. Maria leaned in closer to Tommy, her curiosity piqued. "What did you see?" "I don't know. It was like a shadow moving between the trees. But it wasn't an animal. It was different. It wasn't right." The group fell into a long silence, each of them trying to make sense of what Tommy had said. It was easy to dismiss the thought as imagination. They were in the woods, after all, but something about the way Tommy had said it stuck in their minds. The forest felt wrong that night, as the campfire crackled and the stars twinkled overhead, the scouts tried to relax, forcing smiles and casual conversation. But the feeling of being watched never went away. The trees, thick with their ancient bark, seemed to press in around them, their shadows shifting with the wind. The forest felt alive, breathing with a strange, primal energy. As they settled into their tents, an unnatural quiet descended once more. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The darkness seemed to stretch further than it should, and the wind didn't even whisper through the branches. Then, just as they were beginning to drift off to sleep, a loud crack echoed through the woods. It sounded like a tree branch snapping, but it was louder, more deliberate. They all froze, straining to listen, but there was nothing. No animal, no breeze, just the distant rustling of leaves. The sound came again, closer. Tommy shot up from his sleeping bag. "Did you hear that? There's something out there." Lucas reached for the flashlight by his side. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice low. "Stay calm. I'll check it out." Before anyone could protest, he unzipped his tent and stepped out into the night, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dark. For what seemed like an eternity, they waited in the silence, hearing only the occasional rustle of leaves. Then the flashlight beam cut across the campsite, sweeping toward the edge of the trees. But Lucas didn't come back. They waited and waited. Finally, after what felt like hours, Maria couldn't take it anymore. "We have to go look for him," she said, her voice shaking. The others nodded, but no one moved. They all knew it was too dangerous. Tommy was the first to speak, his voice quivering. We need to leave now." But before they could gather their things, the ground beneath them shifted again. The earth seemed to breathe beneath their feet, like it was alive. They could hear it, a deep, throbbing pulse that seemed to come from the very heart of the forest. And then they saw it. The trees were moving, not just swaying in the wind. No, they were shifting, groaning, their massive trunks bending and twisting as if they were alive, reaching toward them. The roots twisted and coiled like snakes, creeping across the ground in their direction. It was then they realized that the forest wasn't just a collection of trees. It was something much older, something far more sinister. The trees were hungry. Maria screamed as she saw the outline of a figure emerge from the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the dark. It was Lucas, but his face was twisted with terror, his body unnaturally stiff. He moved like a puppet, and the moment he came closer, they saw it. His body was fused to the tree. His face was locked in an expression of pure, frozen fear, his skin pale and cracked like bark. It was too late. The forest had claimed its prize. The trees closed in around them, their roots dragging them beneath the earth, their bark like claws. The forest had fed, and it always needed more. And so, the scouts vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness of the woods. Years later, hikers would pass through the forest, and if they listened closely, they would hear the whispers of those who'd come before, faint echoes, frozen in the trees, never to be free. The forest that feeds, always hungry, always waiting.